Hello and welcome back to another episode of Nick Tiffany's Movie Reviews, coming at you live in print and online format at nicktiffany.com, in audio wherever you get your podcasts, and even on video on YouTube. Today we are talking about another Netflix contender doing an early theatrical run before it arrives on streaming, and that is May December. This was one I didn't know much of anything about it going into it. I knew Julianne Moore was doing a new movie with Natalie Portman. I knew Todd Haynes was directing it. The only other thing I'd really seen from him was Carol, which had Rooney Mara and Cate Blanchett. Oscar nominated Carol, I should say. I knew he does drama incredibly well, kind of explores differences and some age gaps, things like that. So before going to the screening, I'm running out the door. I check IMDb. I'm like, let me get a little synopsis, see what it's about. I'm like, okay, there was some tabloid story. There's this couple, there's definitely an age gap or something between them. And now there's something happening in Hollywood where they're going to be examined. And so that's, I guess, what I got out of it as I looked at it super quickly. So I get to the theater, I sit down, and I'm like, okay, his last movie kind of had a little bit about power dynamics as well. So Julianne Moore, she's an older actress maybe, kind of dated a younger Natalie Portman, I'm sure. And now they're like reevaluating their relationship or something. I'm like, all right, I'm in for an interesting lesbian drama kind of depicting this age gap. I'm down. So what a shock to me as the film starts playing and you're like, okay, Julianne Moore definitely is the older one in the relationship, but it's not Natalie Portman that she's dating. Because Natalie Portman's character is actually here to study, Elizabeth is Natalie Portman's character. She's studying Gracie, who's Julianne Moore's character. And Gracie is sort of our stand-in for Mary Kay Letourneau. And if you know that name, I'm sure why I was shocked. If you don't know that name, she was a 30-something-year-old teacher in the Seattle area who, I don't even want to say has an affair with a 12 or 13-year-old child. But yes, a gross misuse of power and just like earth-shattering in a number of ways. She had a family. She had kids. She's saying she's in love with this minor, this child, and then has a child by him and then marries the child eventually. And just like a really, I think this was the late 90s, like really sensationalist story. It's crazy because people are like, how could anyone be attracted to a child? And like, what would ever make you risk ever? Like, it's just gross. It's just gross and it's uncomfortable. So immediately I'm watching this movie and I'm like, okay, so Julianne Moore is a predator here. Okay, but she's married this guy. Eventually, they've had 3 kids, and where this story is kind of taking place is Natalie Portman's character Elizabeth comes in. We're going to be doing an independent movie about your story, your love story, this complicated love story. And so I want to study your family. I want to be here. I want to study, learn about you guys, watch your dynamic, kind of find a way to tell the world your love story was real. Whatever an actress also needs to kind of convince a kind of tough character, like, yeah, we're gonna show a really interesting side of your love. Like, we're not out to make you look like a monster. But if that happens, it's like, that is what it is. The story is the story, but what you feel you're entitled to. And so that's what we're actually dealing with when it comes to May, December. This is a story looking at this woman, looking at her husband and exploring, is it trauma? Is it guilt? Is it denial? All of this stuff kind of going in the background. And I got to say that like the most shocking thing, other than learning actually what the film was about, was how the director Todd Haynes handles it all. Because what stood out to me is there's these moments with jarring music and like dun 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 dun, and you're getting all these classical things that the mood they kind of establish is this, like, it's shocking, bombastic, but it's almost expected, or it's almost like, they want you to kind of feel this like sudden urge of like, oh my gosh, this is crazy, but it's this dramatic kind of crazy. It's this almost like it's a little bit extra. Camp is how I've seen some describe it, and not campy, but this like, of course, I'm not going to be the best one to tell you the definition of camp. So we're just actually going to look it up right here because it's not it's not a hut. You know, I don't know if we're going all right, camp definition slang. Yes, it's eccentric, ridiculous, unexpected, out of the ordinary. I'm not saying it's an LGBTQ term, but it's certainly used, I think, regarded as some of the performances from drag go, from different films. It's a way to express something that is probably ridiculous in nature. Ridiculous, like a 36-year-old woman claiming that a 12-year-old boy was in love with her and like consented to all of this stuff, and it was love. And so, what is a very human reaction, I think, for us to feel like really uncomfortable by a lot of stuff, or like, hey, grandma, says someone who's like the same age as this guy. And it's like, there's just shocking stuff that in a lot of ways you would, you know, just really feel this like silent uneasiness, queasiness, like, oh my God, this is horrifying. The way it's handled by the director, some of it is in that camp style structure of just like, she just said grandma, like that's her great, like they're the same. It's this ludicrous side of just, oh, uncomfortability, but it just, I don't want to say it justifies it for us, but it's that weird thing where when we get uncomfortable as people, you kind of laugh, you giggle, you're like, I don't know why I'm uncomfortable, and I don't know why I'm laughing, but it's just weird. And watching this movie, I felt that so many times, and not in a negative way, but it's like, it almost felt like the only way to handle the story in some ways. And just the realities of some of these situations, because it's so uncomfortable, because it's so fucked up, and just, pardon my French, but it's just like the more you watch, the more you're just like, they're peeling back layers and you didn't think it could get any worse, and then it does, and you're just like, how deep does the rabbit hole go, Alice? I'm like, oh my goodness. The performances are phenomenal. Charles Wu, particularly, playing this once boy coaxed into, I don't want to say trapped in a relationship. Obviously, in the story, this woman kind of has his child behind bars, so it's like already kind of screwed up, but they've raised a family together and the kids are almost out of college. And what you have is almost like a shell of a man who, he just in his physical motion is always hunched. He always feels like he's reserved. Like, even though you're 36 now, you're a full adult. He doesn't know how to behave like one. Or there's things that you really should have experienced in your childhood that just like never happened for him. And so you're watching some of these moments, or you pick up on little comments where you're just like, oh, like your heart's breaking, but you're also like, oh my God, like that. It really shows you, if anybody really needed a refresher or to understand why these gross power dynamics and predatory behaviors and all this stuff is just like screwed up. Like, it is screwed up for someone who's an adult to be attracted to a child. I'm sorry. And then to act on it, it's like all of this is screwed up. And of course, as a 12-year-old child, I'm sure my frontal cortex is hardly developed. You know, I'm like, as a 27-year-old man, there's still things I'm learning and developing. But for a 12-year-old boy to be thrust into all of this, it's just horrifying. And so Julianne Moore, I mean, to her credit, I mean, she's just an incredible actress, one of the greatest that we have working. She's almost, you know, she balances between naive. You feel like she can be a little manipulative. You also feel like, oh, she's just like cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs at times, where you're like, why is this bothering her so much? Or like, what is this reaction here? But so much of it also just highlights too this feeling of like, I don't know if she felt like she did anything wrong. And, you know, Mary Kay Letourneau, it's like, we were in love. You know, there's no justifying what I did. It's just, you don't understand that I loved him and he loved me. And that's stronger than whatever else, you know, you might say I'm a predator or whatever, but it's like, I know I love him and that's why we're together. And it's just like, Oh my God. It's like it's not thousands of years ago where, hey, yes, some young woman is going to be gifted to some 30 something year old man as a bride to be or a package deal for the land or whatever. It's like, no, we don't live in those times. So this is not acceptable. Not that it was acceptable then, but oh my God. And Natalie Portman, her studying of Julianne Moore. She comes in as this actress who is looking to make a name for herself. People recognize her, but it's not probably for the work she wants done yet. And part of what this film also studies, though, is the obsessive side of acting. And I'm not just talking about method acting, but you're fooling yourself if you don't think that when people make a movie that they don't put in tons of time and tons of effort. It's really easy to say you show up and read lines, or it's easy to write a story, it's easy to do whatever. It's not. And especially when you're tackling historical figures, you're tackling real people. I think a lot of people want to do due diligence, obviously, and try to really understand that character. And oftentimes, everyone will tell you the most enjoyable characters to play are villains or are bad guys, because you're like, oh, I'm playing the nice guy who does everything right and everything's just fine, Sure, that's fine. It's not fun. It's not challenging. It doesn't give the audience anything they haven't seen before, but playing a woman who like really thinks that everything was justified and all cool what she did, it's like that's just ripe for storytelling juices. Like what I could get from this woman is incredible. And so some of it also feels a little disingenuous. I don't like there's this side where, yeah, I want to tell your story. I want to do it justice. You're like, girl, you really don't care. This is more about her, or becomes a little bit more about her than it should be. But what this film also really just touches on great, just to kind of wrap this up, because I don't want to talk too much more about this movie. I think it's phenomenal. But now, see, I lost my train of thought. This is the ADHD kicking in. I don't know. I just, at every turn, this movie surprised me. The performances really surprised me, and the depth of how, I don't know, how many of these uncomfortable conversations are handled, or how certain losses or certain feelings of loneliness or just feeling misunderstood, the way that they're communicated through body language, especially Charles Wu. I mean, it's just, I was not expecting this film at all, and I was not expecting to love it as much as I did. It's a complicated story. It's a complex way to kind of handle all of these things. We're going back to it because I remembered the method acting is what I was going to touch on. I know we give a lot of people crap for method acting, and it's like, oh, Jared Leto stayed in character for the Joker all filming, and gifted someone a rat as a joke because he's staying in character. And some people are like, it's disgusting, it's whatever. Daniel Day-Lewis does method acting, and it's like, hey, he's the greatest guy in the world, but he largely keeps to himself, I'm sure, as well. But it's always interesting to see how people feel about it, because some people think it's the truest, highest form of acting. I am becoming the character. What I am doing is I am embodying this character. Whether you think this is a good character or not, or what my actions are great, silly, stupid, unnecessary, this is that character. And I know some people like that who it's like, I think you're like a little bit too into playing this character. There's things they're trying to like live out through the character maybe as well, where you're like, I don't know about this. And so the film touches on acting, creating art, your intention behind it as well, in a really interesting way, especially when it comes to such a scandalous story. May, December, it's going to be on Netflix. Again, another stellar pickup for them. Cannot recommend this one more. Yes, it's uncomfortable in a few ways for sure, but I think especially for newer audience, maybe it gives them a look at like, oh, how kids joke and they're like, oh, my teacher's so hot, and like, I want to have sex with my teacher, whatever. I'm like, that sounds crass. I'm sorry, but this has been a thing for all of time. And, and it's middle schoolers, high schools, whatever. It's real easy to say something. You're like, oh, so-and-so's mom is so hot, man, whatever. It's like, yeah, but you're a 14-year-old kid, nothing's ever going to happen. You would hope nothing ever happens, but then continuously for years, I felt like when I was in high school, we kept seeing stories and it's like, oh, middle school teacher arrested for sleeping with their kid in this class. And you're like, what? How? Why? That's gross. It's disgusting. There's no high fiving. There's no like, oh, bro, he had sex with a teacher. Bro, you're 12 and you had sex with a 36-year-old. There's no high fiving here. There's none of that. And good on the movie for like really kind of emphasizing like, all right, they're like, there's nothing to celebrate here. There's no like, this shit ruins lives all around. And so I'm going to be really interested to see the discourse around this and just how it was handled. But May, December, a must see by the end of the year. As always, if you want to stay tuned for new movie news and reviews, check out NT Movie Reviews on all social media networks, podcast platforms, and on YouTube. As always, thank you again for listening, you guys, and we'll catch you next time.